The heart monitor's steady rhythm turned into a piercing singular tone that would haunt Sarah continuously for the rest of her life. While she screamed for doctors in a sterile hospital room, her husband Richard was silencing his phone in a penthouse suite across town, wrapped in the arms of a woman who wasn't his wife. He thought he was untouchable, a CEO who could buy his way out of any consequence. He was wrong. He didn't know that the grief of a mother would awaken the dormant rage of a man he had dismissed as a senile old fool. The revenge that followed wouldn't just take his money. It would erase his entire existence. Thunder rattled the glass panes of the ICU waiting room at St. Jude's Memorial, mirroring the storm raging inside Sarah Bennett's chest. Her 4-year-old daughter Lily lay pale and small against the white sheets, her breathing shallow and labored. The monitors beeped with a terrifying irregularity, a countdown that Sarah prayed would never reach zero. Dr. Aris Thorne stepped out of the room, his face grim. "Mrs. Bennett, we need to operate immediately. The obstruction is putting pressure on her heart. We need the insurance authorization and the primary policyholder's consent for this specific experimental procedure. It's high risk, but it's her only chance." Sarah's hands trembled as she dialed Richard's number for the 20th time. "I'm trying," she choked out, tears streaming down her face. He's in a crucial board meeting. He said he couldn't be disturbed." "We don't have time for board meetings," Dr. Thorne said, his voice urgent. "We need his digital signature now." Across the city, the rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Ritz-Carlton's presidential suite. Inside, the air was warm and scented with expensive perfume and aged scotch. Richard Bennett, CEO of Bennett Logistics, laughed softly, tracing the rim of his glass. He wasn't in a boardroom. He wasn't reviewing mergers. "You should probably check that," Jessica murmured, nodding toward the phone, buzzing incessantly on the bedside table. She was 23, with ambition that matched Richard's ego. "It's been ringing for an hour." Richard glanced at the screen, saw wife flashing, and flipped the phone face down. "It's just Sarah panicking about Lily's flu. She coddles the girl too much. If I answer, I'll be stuck listening to her cry for 40 minutes. I'd rather listen to you." He pulled Jessica closer, the buzzing of the phone muffled by the heavy duvet. He had convinced himself that his hard work earned him these moments of indiscretion. He provided the mansion, the cars, and the lifestyle. Surely he was entitled to a little fun on the side. Back at the hospital, the situation was spiraling. Sarah's fingers were numb as she texted him, "Lily is dying. Pick up. Please." The message delivered. Richard saw the notification pop up on his smartwatch as he reached for the champagne bottle. He frowned, a flash of annoyance crossing his face. She's always dramatic, he thought. Last time, it was a dying hamster. He swiped the notification away effectively, silencing the final lifeline his daughter had. "Is everything okay?" Jessica asked, feigning concern. "Fine," Richard lied, pouring the drink. "Just a minor domestic issue. Let's focus on us." At that exact moment, the alarms in the ICU reached a fever pitch. Nurses rushed past Sarah, pushing her back as they swarmed the bed. Sarah dropped the phone, the screen cracking against the linoleum floor, just as Richard raised a toast to his own success in the dim light of the hotel room. The silence that followed the chaos was the loudest thing Sarah had ever heard. Dr. Thorne had come out 10 minutes ago, removed his surgical cap, and simply shook his head. The time they had wasted waiting for the authorization, waiting for Richard, had cost them the window of opportunity. Lily's heart, already weak, couldn't handle the strain. Sarah sat on the floor of the hallway, her back against the cold wall. She wasn't crying anymore. She was hollowed out, a shell of a person. It was nearly 2:00 a.m. when Richard finally strolled into the hospital. He had showered, changed back into his suit, and doused himself in cologne to hide the scent of Jessica's perfume. He looked every bit the concerned father, rushing in with a frantic expression he had practiced in the elevator. "Sarah," he called out, spotting her on the floor. He rushed over, crouching down. "My God, the traffic was a nightmare, and my battery died right after the meeting. I came as soon as I got it charged. How is she?" "Is the surgery over?" Sarah slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were red, but her gaze was dead devoid of the warmth he was used to manipulating. She looked at his pristine suit, the perfectly knotted tie. She smelled the faint, cloying scent of lavender soap, the kind the Ritz used, not the brand they had at home. "She's gone, Richard," Sarah whispered. Richard froze. His frantic act faltered, replaced by genuine shock. "What? No, that's impossible. It was just a fever." "It was cardiac failure caused by an untreated infection," Dr. Thorne said, stepping out of the shadows. His voice was cold, sharp as a scalpel. "We tried to reach you. We needed authorization for the bypass. You declined the call." "I didn't decline," Richard's snapped defensive reflex kicking in. "I told you my phone died." "We have the logs, Mr. Bennett," the doctor said, unimpressed. "But that doesn't matter now. You should be with your wife." Richard looked at Sarah, expecting her to collapse into his arms to seek his comfort. Instead, she stood up. She looked small, frail, but there was a stiffness in her posture that was new. "I called you 20 times, Sarah said, her voice devoid of emotion. "I texted you that she was dying. You read it. The receipt said, read at 9:42 p.m. It was a glitch," Richard stammered, sweat prickling his forehead. "Sarah, baby, you're distraught. You're not thinking clearly." Before he could touch her, the elevator doors at the end of the hall slid open. A man stepped out. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, wearing a faded flannel shirt, worn-out jeans and work boots that left faint traces of mud on the sterile floor. He held a battered trucker hat in his hands. It was Arthur Sarah's father. Richard suppressed a sneer. He hated Arthur. He viewed his father-in-law as a failure, a man who spent his life farming dirt in Montana, barely scraping by. Richard had always made sure Arthur felt unwelcome in their high society life. "Dad?" Sarah breathed, her voice finally cracking. Arthur didn't say a word. He walked past Richard as if the CEO were made of glass, pulling his daughter into a crushing hug. Sarah buried her face in the rough flannel and finally screamed, the sound tearing through the hallway. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, uncomfortable. "Arthur, sad time. Look, I need to handle the arrangements. I'll call the funeral home." Arthur looked up over Sarah's shoulder. His eyes were a startling icy blue, set deep in a weathered face. For the first time, Richard noticed something unsettled behind those eyes. Not sadness, but a cold, calculating fury. "You won't handle a damn thing," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble, like distant thunder. "Excuse me." Richard bristled. "She was my daughter. I pay for everything in this family. I will handle the best service money can buy." "Money bought you a hotel room tonight, didn't it?" Arthur asked quietly. Richard went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." Arthur gently released Sarah and took a step toward Richard. The old farmer was shorter than the CEO, but he seemed to take up all the oxygen in the corridor. "You think because I wear boots and drive a truck that I'm deaf and blind? I know where you were. And I know who you were with." "You're delusional, old man," Richard scoffed, regaining his composure. "Grief makes people say crazy things." "Go home, Richard," Arthur said. "Go back to your penthouse. Sarah is coming with me." "She's my wife." "She's my daughter," Arthur corrected, "and you just killed her child." Richard watched fuming as Arthur led Sarah away. He pulled out his phone to call his lawyer, ready to file for custody or whatever legal maneuver would save face. But as he unlocked the screen, he saw a text message from an unknown number. It was a photo of him and Jessica entering the hotel room 3 hours ago. The caption read, "The clock starts now." The funeral service for Lily Bennett was a masterpiece of public relations management, exactly as Richard had intended. The skies over the private cemetery in the hills were overcast, casting a somber grey light that Richard felt suited the gravity of the occasion perfectly. He stood by the open grave, wearing sunglasses that cost more than most people's cars, his hand resting performatively on the mahogany casket. Photographers were kept at a respectful distance, but close enough to capture Richard's calculated stoicism. He dabbed at his dry eyes with a silk handkerchief, ensuring his profile was caught by the lenses. To the world, he was the grieving titan of industry, shattered by the loss of his only child. Sarah stood 10 feet away from him, refusing to play her part in his tableau. She wore no makeup to hide the dark circles under her eyes, and her black dress was simple, unbranded, and severe. She didn't look at the cameras. She stared only at the small plaque on the casket that read, "Lily." Arthur stood beside his daughter, his hand gripping her shoulder with a strength that belied his age. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a clean-pressed pair of black work trousers, a white button-down, and a dark wool coat that looked decades old. He looked out of place among the city's elite, yet he possessed a dignity that made the CEOs and socialites around him look like children playing dress-up. As the priest intoned the final prayers, a murmur rippled through the back of the crowd. A black sedan, sleek and devoid of any manufacturer badges, had pulled up silently on the gravel path. Richard frowned behind his sunglasses. He hadn't authorized any late arrivals. He watched as a man stepped out. The stranger was tall, with silver hair, swept back and a scar running through his left eyebrow. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that made Richard's Italian tailoring look off the rack. The stranger didn't approach Richard. He walked straight to Arthur. Richard watched in disbelief as the stranger bowed his head slightly to the old farmer. They spoke in hushed tones, the stranger handing Arthur a thick, cream-colored envelope. Arthur nodded, once slipped the envelope into his coat pocket, and returned his gaze to the grave. After the service, as the crowd began to disperse toward the buffet of lobster rolls and champagne, Richard had ordered. Richard cornered his father-in-law. "Arthur," Richard barked, abandoning the grieving father act. "Who was that? I didn't approve the guest list for strangers to crash my daughter's funeral." Arthur turned slowly. "That was Silas Mercer. He's an old friend." Richard let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "Silas Mercer, the investment banker from New York." "Don't make me laugh. How would a dirt farmer from Montana know a man who manages half of Wall Street's private equity?" "We served on a board together once," Arthur said, simply, his voice flat. "You—" "On a board?" Richard sneered, checking his watch. "Arthur, I know you're grieving, but let's not invent fantasies. Look, I'm sorry about the other night at the hospital. Stress makes us all say things we don't mean. But Sarah is coming home with me today. We need to present a united front for the shareholders. I mean, for the family." "Sarah isn't going anywhere with you," Arthur said. "She's filed for divorce. The papers are being served to your office as we speak." Richard's face flushed red. "You can't do that. I have the best lawyers in the city. I'll bury you in legal fees, so deep you'll lose that pathetic farm of yours." Arthur finally smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a wolf that had cornered a rabbit. "You think the farm is all I have, Richard? You never did ask Sarah about her mother's side of the family. You never asked about my life before the farm. You just saw dirt under my fingernails and assumed that was all there was." Before Richard could respond, Silas Mercer approached them. Up close, the man radiated a terrifying kind of power. He ignored Richard entirely and addressed Arthur. "The asset freeze is ready, sir. We're just waiting for your signal." "Do it," Arthur said softly. Richard looked between them, a cold knot forming in his stomach. "What asset freeze? Who do you think you are?" Silas finally looked at Richard, his eyes devoid of warmth. "Mr. Bennett, I suggest you check your accounts, all of them." Richard scoffed and pulled out his phone to check his banking app, expecting to see his millions securely sitting in the Cayman offshore accounts he had hidden from Sarah. Face ID authorized. The screen loaded. Balance 0. He swiped to his business operating account. 0 doubles. He swiped to his investment portfolio. Locked by SEC investigation. "What is this?" Richard hissed, shaking the phone at Arthur. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything," Arthur said, turning to walk away with Sarah. "I just made a few phone calls. Enjoy the walk home, Richard. I hear the repo men are already towing your Aston Martin from the parking lot." 3 days after the funeral, Richard Bennett was sitting in a darkened office that felt more like a prison cell. The power had been cut to the executive floor of Bennett Logistics due to accounting irregularities, leaving him to work by the light of his laptop and the city glow filtering through the blinds. His personal accounts were frozen. His credit cards were declined. Even the company corporate card he used to pay for Jessica's apartment had bounced, leading to a hysterical phone call from his mistress, where she accused him of being a fraud before blocking his number. He wasn't ruined yet. He had connections, favors he could call in. But the speed of the attack had terrified him. He needed information. The door creaked open, and Gareth Cole walked in. Gareth was a private investigator who specialized in corporate espionage and blackmail. He was expensive, unethical, and efficient. Richard had paid him with the last stash of cash he kept in his office safe. "Tell me you have something," Richard demanded, standing up. "Tell me Arthur is a fraud. Tell me he's laundering money for a cartel. I need something to get the feds off my back and onto his." Gareth didn't sit down. He looked shaken. He tossed a thin manila folder onto Richard's mahogany desk. It seemed incredibly light for the amount of money Richard had paid. "I'm done, Bennett," Gareth said, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm refunding your money. I don't want any part of this." "What?" Richard grabbed the folder. "What are you talking about? It's just an old man in a flannel shirt." "That old man is Arthur Caldwell," Gareth whispered, looking over his shoulder at the door. "Does that name mean anything to you?" "No, it's a common name." "Maybe you're too young," Gareth said, wiping sweat from his upper lip. In the late 80s, there was a corporate liquidator based out of Chicago. They called him the Thresher. He didn't just buy companies. He dismantled them. He would find the corruption, the rot, and he would expose it, gut the leadership, and sell the pieces. He was ruthless. He destroyed 3 Fortune 500 CEOs in 1992 alone. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. So that was 30 years ago. The Thresher vanished in 95 after his wife died, Gareth continued. Disappeared completely. People thought he was dead. Turns out he bought 1,000 acres in Montana to raise his daughter in peace. He wanted a quiet life. He wanted to be a farmer. Gareth leaned in his eyes wide. You poked the bear, Richard. You took the one thing he came out of retirement to protect. You killed his granddaughter. Richard opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a dossier on Arthur. It was a photocopy of a page from a handwritten ledger. At the top of the page, written in neat cursive ink, was the date October 14th, 2025, the day Lily died. Below it was a list. 1. Richard Bennett, destruction of assets. 2. Bennett Logistics, liquidation. 3. The mistress, public exposure. 4. The board of directors, criminal indictments. Next to the first two items, there was a neat red check mark. He's not suing you, Richard, Gareth said, backing toward the door. He's dismantling you. Systematically. He has a ledger, and he's crossing names off. I can fight him, Richard blustered, though his hands were shaking. I'm the CEO of a billion-dollar logistics firm. I have leverage. You have nothing, Gareth snapped. Do you know who sits on the board of the bank that holds your company's loans? Silas Mercer. Do you know who owns the land your main distribution centers are built on? A holding company owned by the Caldwell Trust. He owns the ground you walk on, Richard. Gareth opened the door. My advice, run. Leave the country. Go somewhere with no extradition treaty. Because Arthur Caldwell doesn't stop until the ledger is balanced. Gareth left the heavy door slamming shut. Richard stared at the paper. He wanted to rip it up, to laugh it off, but fear was paralyzing him. He grabbed his office phone to call his chief financial officer, to scream at someone to fix this. The line was dead. Suddenly, his laptop screen flickered. The spreadsheet he had been looking at vanished, replaced by a live video feed. It was grainy footage, black and white. It showed a hotel hallway. Richard squinted. It was the Ritz-Carlton. He saw himself walking down the hall, his arm around Jessica. He saw them enter the room. Then the audio kicked in. It was crystal clear. It's just Sarah, panicking about Lily's flu. I'd rather listen to you. Richard's blood turned to ice. The video cut to black, and a single line of text appeared on the screen in white letters. Part 3. The mistress. Uploading to social media. 98% complete. Richard scrambled to close the laptop, slamming the lid shut, but the upload bar burned in his mind. He grabbed his cell phone. Notifications were already flooding in. Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. The video was everywhere. His reputation wasn't just damaged, it was incinerated. And somewhere in Montana, on a porch overlooking a quiet field, Arthur Caldwell sat in a rocking chair, a red pen in his hand, marking a check next to the third item on his list. The elevators to the 40th floor of the Bennett Logistics Tower were usually silent, smooth rides that Richard Bennett associated with his ascent to power. Today, the hum of the lift felt like the vibration of a coffin being lowered into the earth. He had spent the last 12 hours scrubbing the internet, threatening lawsuit after lawsuit, but the video of him and Jessica was like a hydra cut one link, and 3 more appeared. His PR firm had resigned an hour ago via email. His lawyer was dodging his calls, but Richard still had the company. As long as he held the CEO title and the voting shares, he had power. He could spin this. He could claim the video was a deep fake, an AI-generated attack by corporate rivals. He stormed into the boardroom, disheveled, his eyes bloodshot. his tie slightly askew. "All right, listen to me," Richard bellowed as he threw the heavy oak doors open. "We are under attack. I want a press release denying everything. I want a forensic team on that video proving it's fake. And I want—" His voice died in his throat. The boardroom was full. The entire board of directors was present, seated around the long glass table. Usually they were a chatty, sycophantic bunch, eager to laugh at Richard's jokes. Today the silence was absolute. They didn't look at him. They looked at the papers in front of them. And at the head of the table in Richard's chair sat Arthur Caldwell. The old farmer was wearing the same flannel shirt he had worn to the hospital, contrasting sharply with the million-dollar view of the city skyline behind him and the Italian suits of the board members. On the table in front of him sat the ledger. "Get out of my chair," Richard hissed, marching forward, though his legs felt like lead. "Security. Why is this trespasser in here?" "Sit down, Mr. Bennett," said Marcus Sterling, the chairman of the board. Sterling was a man Richard had golfed with for 10 years, a man whose vacation home Richard had paid for. Sterling's voice was devoid of friendship. "You don't give orders here anymore," Sterling continued. "We've just concluded an emergency vote." "You can't vote without me." Richard slammed his hands on the table. "I own 30% of the voting stock." "Actually," Arthur spoke up, his voice calm and gravelly, "you own nothing. Your shares were leveraged against personal loans from unparalleled margin calls, loans held by Mercer Capital." Arthur tapped the ledger with his calloused finger. "When the stock price tanked this morning, plummeting 40%, thanks to your little home movie, Mercer called the loans. You defaulted. Your shares have been seized and sold." "Sold to who?" Richard whispered, the room spinning. "To the Caldwell Trust," Arthur said, finally looking up. His blue eyes pierced right through Richard. "I own your company, Richard. I own your desk. I own the chair you're standing next to." Richard looked around the room, searching for an ally. "Jim Brender. You're going to let a farmer run a logistics empire. He doesn't know anything about supply chains." "I know about weeds," Arthur said softly. "And I know how to pull them out by the root." Arthur opened a folder on the table. "While digging through the financials to acquire the shares, my auditors found something interesting. A shell company called Apex Consulting. You've been funneling company funds into it for 3 years." Richard stopped breathing. That was his escape fund, his secret money. "You used corporate assets to pay for the penthouse," Arthur continued, reading from the sheet. "To pay for the jewelry, to pay for the silencers on the rumors, and most damning of all, you transferred $200,000 from the Employee Healthcare Emergency Fund to cover a gambling debt in Vegas last month." The board members gasped. Stealing from the company was one thing. Stealing from the Employee Emergency Fund was a PR death sentence. "That fund," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, "was the specific pool of money that would have covered the experimental surgery your insurance denied for Lily. You denied your own daughter's surgery to pay a bookie." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Richard staggered back, his back hitting the wall. That's a lie. It's accounting tricks. It's grand larceny," Sterling said coldly. "And fraud. We've already contacted the district attorney. They are on their way up." Arthur stood up slowly. He picked up the red pen. He looked at the whiteboard where the meeting agenda was usually written. In big, bold letters, someone had written, "Richard Bennett." Arthur walked to the board and drew a thick red line through the name. "You're fired, Richard," Arthur said. "For cause. No severance. No golden parachute. No stock options. You leave with nothing but the suit on your back, and frankly, I'm tempted to take that too." "You can't do this," Richard screamed, his composure shattering completely. "I built this company." "You built a house of cards," Arthur said, "and I just opened the window." Richard looked at the door. He could hear sirens in the distance getting closer. The wail of the police cars seemed to be singing his name. Panic, primal and blinding, took over. He couldn't go to prison. He wouldn't survive it. He bolted. He turned and ran out of the boardroom, ignoring the shouts of the directors. He sprinted down the hallway, bypassing the elevators, and burst into the stairwell. He had to run. He had to get to the contingency plan. Richard stumbled out of the service exit into the pouring rain in the alleyway behind the skyscraper. He was gasping for air, his expensive Italian loafers splashing into puddles of grime and oil. He checked his phone. No signal. He had likely been SIM-swapped or cut off. He patted his pocket. He still had the key to a storage unit in the industrial district near the airport. That was his true insurance policy. Inside that unit was a duffel bag containing $500,000 in cash, 3 fake passports, and a hard drive with blackmail material on half the city council. If he could get to that bag, he could disappear. He could start over in Brazil or Thailand. He couldn't take a taxi. Digital payments would track him. He couldn't call a reckless driver. He saw a delivery van idling the driver, busy unloading boxes at a loading dock. Desperation turned Richard into a criminal. He jumped into the driver's seat of the van. The keys were in the ignition. He slammed the door, revved the engine, and peeled out of the alley just as 2 police cruisers screeched to a halt at the front of the building. He drove like a madman, weaving through traffic, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "I can make it," he told himself. "I'm Richard Bennett. I always win." He reached the Safekeep self-storage facility 40 minutes later. The rain was coming down in sheets now, a torrential downpour that blurred the world into grey and black. He parked the stolen van behind a row of rusted containers and ran toward Unit 404. His hands shook so badly he dropped the key twice. Finally, he jammed it into the padlock and twisted. The lock clicked open. He threw the corrugated metal door up the noise echoing like a gunshot. He froze. The unit should have been filled with boxes of old files to hide the safe in the back. But the unit was empty. Completely bare. Swept clean. In the center of the concrete floor, illuminated by the flickering fluorescent hallway light, sat a single wooden stool. On the stool was a small battery-operated digital picture frame. Richard walked toward it, his legs trembling. The frame was cycling through photos. Click. A photo of Richard entering the storage unit 3 years ago to hide the money. Click. A photo of Richard bribing a city official. Click. A photo of Lily's grave. And next to the frame was a note. Interest, payments. A. No! Richard screamed, kicking the stool over. The frame skittered across the floor. No, 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 my money, my passports! He fell to his knees, clawing at his hair. He was trapped. He had no money, no identity, and the police were hunting him. Wait. The pilot. He had a private pilot on retainer, a man named Captain Halloway, who owed Richard a life debt. Halloway didn't care about laws. If Richard could get to the private airfield, Halloway would fly him out money or not. Richard scrambled back to the van. He had one card left to play. The drive to the private airfield was a blur of terror. Every set of headlights in his rear-view mirror looked like a cop car. When he finally crashed through the chain-link gate of the airfield, his tires blown out, he saw it. His Gulfstream jet was sitting on the tarmac engines, whining ready for takeoff. The stairs were down. The cabin lights were on. "Yes," Richard sobbed, scrambling out of the van. He ran across the tarmac, the rain soaking him to the bone, ruining his suit, washing away the last veneer of the CEO. He was just a desperate animal now. He bounded up the stairs of the jet and slammed the hatch shut behind him. "Halloway, go get us in the air now," Richard screamed, collapsing into one of the plush leather seats. "Head for Cabo. I'll explain later." The engines roared, the pitch increasing. The plane began to taxi. Richard let out a long, ragged breath, closing his eyes. He had made it. He was safe. He would rebuild. He always did. "Champagne, sir." The voice came from the front of the cabin. It wasn't the flight attendant. Richard's eyes snapped open. Emerging from the cockpit wasn't Captain Halloway. It was Silas Mercer, the man from the cemetery. He was holding a bottle of Dom Perignon and 2 glasses. And sitting in the captain's chair, visible through the open cockpit door, wearing a headset and looking back with a grim smile, was Arthur Caldwell. "We aren't going to Cabo, Richard," Arthur said over the intercom, his voice booming through the cabin speakers. Richard scrambled up, rushing to the door, but the plane was already picking up speed, the runway lights blurring past. "Let me off," Richard shrieked, banging on the cockpit door. "You're kidnapping me!" "Kidnapping?" Silas asked calmly, pouring the drink. "This is your plane, Richard, or it was until this morning. Now it's a company asset, and since the company is under new management, we're just taking a business trip." "To where?" Richard gasped, backing away, until he hit the bulkhead. Arthur turned the plane onto the main runway, throttling the engines to maximum. The force pushed Richard back into his seat. "We're going back to where you started," Arthur's voice crackled. "But first we're going to make a little detour. I promised Lily I'd show you something." As the plane lifted off into the storm, Richard looked out the window. Below them on the wet tarmac, he saw the flashing lights of a dozen police cars and FBI SUVs swarming the runway, too late to stop the plane. But Richard realized with a sickening jolt that being arrested would have been the safer option. He was now at 30,000 feet, with a man who had nothing left to lose and a ledger that still had one unchecked box. The Gulfstream 4 cut through the stratosphere at 45,000 feet, a silent silver dagger suspended in the void of the night. Inside the pressurized cabin, the luxury that Richard Bennett had spent a lifetime accumulating now felt like the walls of a coffin. The air was chilled, filtered, and recycling the scent of his own terror. Richard sat strapped into the cream-colored leather captain's chair. His chair. His hands were gripping the armrests so tightly that the knuckles were bloodless, stark white against the dark wood trim. Across from him, Silas Mercer lounged with the casual elegance of a predator who had already eaten. He swirled the vintage Dom Perignon in a crystal flute, the bubbles rising in a lazy, hypnotic dance. "You can't do this," Richard said, his voice trembling, lacking the baritone command that had silenced boardrooms for a decade. "This is kidnapping. International airspace. The moment we land, I'll have you both arrested for unlawful imprisonment." Silas didn't even look up from his glass. "Technically, Richard, we're just taking a company asset for a spin. As the new majority owner of Bennett Logistics, the Caldwell Trust has authorized this flight. You're just a passenger, a very distressed passenger." The cockpit door clicked open. The sound was sharp, mechanical, and final. Arthur Caldwell stepped into the cabin. He had engaged the autopilot. He wasn't wearing a pilot's uniform. He was still in his flannel shirt and work boots, a jarring anachronism against the plush carpet and mahogany bulkheads. But as he walked down the aisle, the air in the cabin seemed to grow heavier. He didn't look like a farmer anymore. The slouch was gone. His eyes were clear, cold, and assessing. This was the Thresher, the corporate executioner who had terrified Wall Street 30 years ago. Arthur sat in the seat, directly facing Richard, completing the triangle. He placed the black ledger on the table between them. "Where are we going, Arthur?" Richard asked, his breath hitching. "If you take me to some black site. If you hurt me, pain is fleeting, Richard." Arthur said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the table. "I have no interest in hurting you physically. That would be too easy. That would be mercy. And I am fresh out of mercy." "Then what do you want, money?" Richard leaned forward, desperation sharpening his features. "I have money. Real money. Not the company accounts you froze. I have a contingency fund, $10 million in bearer bonds, sitting in a deposit box in Zurich. I can give you the key. I can give you the codes. Just land the plane. Let me walk away." Silas chuckled softly, a dry, humorless sound. "He still doesn't get it, Arthur. He thinks he can buy his way out of a burning building. Everything is a transaction." Richard snapped a flash of his old arrogance, piercing through the fear. "Don't pretend you're above it, Arthur. You're a dirt farmer. Do you know what $10 million could do for you? You could buy half of Montana. You could burn that pathetic shack you live in and build a palace." Arthur stared at him. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He just looked at Richard with a profound, terrifying pity. "You really are a poor man, Richard," Arthur said softly. "You think wealth is a number on a screen. I had that wealth. In 1992, I liquidated a tech firm in Silicon Valley and walked away with $40 million in a single afternoon. Do you know what I did with it?" Richard stared, silent. "Nothing," Arthur answered. "I watched my wife die of cancer 6 months later. All that money, and I couldn't buy her a single extra hour. That's when I learned the truth. Currency isn't money. Currency is time. Currency is honor. You spent your time in a hotel room with a stranger while your daughter fought for her life. You spent your honor covering it up." Arthur reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. He slid it across the polished table. It was a picture of Lily. She was sitting on the porch of Arthur's farmhouse, holding a small, bruised apple she had picked herself. She was beaming. "She called me that night, you know," Arthur said, his voice cracking slightly before hardening into steel. "Before she got sick. She asked if her daddy was coming to her birthday party next week. I told her yes. I lied to her, Richard, because I knew you wouldn't come. You never came." Richard looked at the photo. The image blurred as tears welled in his eyes. Not tears of grief, but tears of self-pity. "I was busy. I was building a legacy for her." "You were building a tomb," Arthur corrected. "And now we are going to seal it." Arthur opened the ledger. He tapped the page with a thick, calloused finger. "Item 3, the mistress," Arthur read. "Jessica didn't just give an interview, Richard. She gave the district attorney your burner phone, the one you left at her apartment. It contains every text message you sent to your fixers. It contains the authorization codes for the wire transfers to the Cayman Islands. She traded you in for immunity. She's walking free. You aren't." Richard gasped, his hands flying to his mouth. She wouldn't." "She did. Loyalty is expensive, Richard, and you stopped paying. Arthur turned the page. Item 4, the board. They didn't just fire you. They are suing you for breach of fiduciary duty. They are seizing your personal assets to cover the shareholder lawsuits. The penthouse gone. The cars repossessed. Even this plane. Silas. Silas nodded. We're filing the transfer of title as we speak. This jet is now the property of the Lily Bennett Foundation for Pediatric Care. You stripped me, Richard whispered, sinking back into the seat. You took everything. Not everything, Arthur said. You still have your freedom for about another 40 minutes. Richard looked out the window. Far below, the clouds had broken. A vast grid of golden lights sprawled out in the darkness. It wasn't Mexico. It wasn't the Caribbean. It was New York. We're going back, Richard breathed, the horror setting in. You're taking me back. I'm taking you to justice, Arthur said. But how you face that justice, that is the negotiation. Richard looked at Arthur, confused. What negotiation? You have the evidence. You have the witnesses. I'm dead. You are going to prison, Richard. That is inevitable, Arthur said, leaning and his blue eyes locking onto Richard's. But there are prisons, and then there are prisons. Arthur placed a folder on the table. It was stamped with the Department of Justice seal. This is a plea deal, Arthur said. I called in a favor with the U.S. Attorney, an old friend from my Chicago days. The deal is simple. You plead guilty to all charges. Fraud, embezzlement, and involuntary manslaughter for the gross negligence that led to the death of 3 warehouse workers last year, and the neglect of your child. Manslaughter, Richard squeaked. I never killed anyone. You cut the budget for safety sensors. Men died. That's on you, Arthur said. Here is the choice. Option A. You fight this. You hire lawyers. You drag Sarah through a 2-year trial. You force her to testify about the night Lily died. You force her to relive that trauma in 4K resolution on court TV. Arthur's voice dropped an octave, becoming a guttural growl. If you do that, if you make my daughter cry in a courtroom, I will ensure you are sent to Blackgate Penitentiary. I will ensure you are placed in the general population, and I will make sure every man in your cell block knows that you are the rich CEO who let his kid die to sleep with a mistress. You won't last a week, Richard. Richard shook his head rapidly, sweat flying from his brow. No, please. Blackgate is a slaughterhouse. Option B. Arthur continued, his voice calming. You sign this. You plead guilty tomorrow morning. You spare Sarah the trial. You take your punishment like a man. In exchange, I use my leverage to have you remanded to a federal camp in Pennsylvania. Minimum security. No fences. You'll teach business classes to inmates. You'll be bored. You'll be forgotten. But you will be safe. Richard stared at the folder. It was a lifeline. A pathetic, thin lifeline, but the only one he had. Why? Richard asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. Why offer me a way out? You hate me. I do, Arthur admitted. I hate you more than I have ever hated a living thing. But I love my daughter more. This isn't for you, Richard. This is for Sarah. She needs closure. She needs you gone quietly and quickly so she can mourn. Richard looked at Silas, looking for a bluff. Silas just raised his glass in a mock toast. Tick-tock, Richard. We're beginning our initial descent. Richard looked down at his trembling hands. He thought about the courtroom. He thought about the cameras. But mostly he thought about the cold, concrete reality of Blackgate versus a quiet camp in Pennsylvania. He wasn't a fighter. He was a coward who hid behind money. And without money, he was nothing. "Give me the pen," Richard whispered. Arthur slid a heavy silver pen across the table. Richard opened the folder. His hand shook so violently he could barely hold the pen. He signed his name on the dotted line. Richard Bennett. It was a signature that used to move millions of dollars. Now it just purchased his own survival. "Done," Richard said, dropping the pen. "Are you happy?" "Happiness isn't the goal, Richard," Arthur said, taking the folder and handing it to Silas. "Balance is." The plane banked sharply. The landing gear deployed with a heavy thud clunk that vibrated through the floor. The engines whined down shifting pitch as they prepared for landing. Richard looked out the window. The runway lights rushed up to meet them, a blur of white and red. As the wheels kissed the tarmac and the reverse thrusters roared, Richard saw the reception committee. It was a sea of flashing lights. Dozens of police cruisers, FBI SUVs, and unmarked federal vehicles formed a barricade around the private hangar. And behind them, held back by temporary fencing, was a mob of reporters. The news trucks had their satellite dishes extended. The world was watching. The plane slowed to a halt. The engine spooled down into silence. "Time to go," Arthur said, standing up. He buttoned his flannel shirt to the top, adjusting his collar. "I can't go out there," Richard panicked, unbuckling his seatbelt but refusing to stand. "Look at them. They'll tear me apart." "They just want a picture," Silas said, standing and straightening his suit. "Smile, Richard. It's your last press-op." Arthur opened the main cabin door. The stairs unfolded automatically. The cool night air rushed in, carrying the chaotic noise of the tarmac. Shouts, sirens, the whir of helicopter blades overhead. "After you," Arthur said, gesturing to the open door. Richard stood up on shaky legs. He felt nauseous. He walked to the doorway and looked down. The glare of the floodlights was blinding. He squinted against the harsh white light. At the bottom of the stairs, flanked by 2 FBI agents in windbreakers, stood a solitary figure. It was Sarah. She wore a black coat, her hands deep in her pockets. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but she didn't brush it away. She was looking up at him. Her expression wasn't angry. It wasn't sad. It was completely, utterly indifferent. She looked at him as if he were a stranger, as if he were nothing. That look hurt more than the handcuffs. "Move," Arthur said gently from behind him. Richard took the first step, then the second. The cameras went wild. The shutter clicks sounded like a swarm of locusts devouring a field. Questions were shouted from the press pen. "Richard, did you kill her? Richard, how much did you steal? Richard, look over here." He reached the bottom of the stairs. An FBI agent stepped forward, spinning him around. Richard didn't resist. He felt the cold steel of the handcuffs snap around his wrists. "Richard Bennett, you are under arrest." The agent recited the words, blurring into a dull hum in Richard's ears. As they led him toward the waiting squad car, Richard tried to catch Sarah's eye one last time. "Sarah," he cried out, his voice thin and pathetic. "Sarah, I'm sorry." She didn't blink. She turned her back on him and walked toward a waiting truck, an old, battered pickup truck with Montana plates. Richard was shoved into the back of the cruiser. The door slammed shut, muffling the noise of the world he had lost. Through the wire mesh of the window, he watched the scene unfold. Silas Mercer was shaking hands with the lead FBI agent, handing over the folder with the signed plea deal. And Arthur Caldwell stood alone at the top of the stairs of the jet. He looked down at the chaos, at the flashing lights, at the ruined man in the police car. Slowly, deliberately, Arthur reached into his breast pocket. He pulled out the battered leather ledger. He braced it against the railing of the stairs. He uncapped his red pen. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the moment lived for the national news. Arthur marked a thick final check mark next to the last line. 4. Richard Bennett, Justice. He capped the pen. He closed the book. He didn't smile. He didn't wave to the cameras. He simply turned around, walked back into the plane, and closed the heavy door, shutting out the noise, the lights, and the man who had forgotten that even giants can fall. This story is a brutal reminder that money can buy Penthouse's silence and luxury, but it cannot buy immunity from the consequences of our own cruelty. Richard Bennett believed he was a god because he sat in a high-rise, forgetting that the foundation of his life was built on the love of the people he betrayed. He viewed relationships as transactions and people as assets, failing to realize that the most powerful currency in the world is loyalty and love. 2 things he went bankrupt in long before his accounts froze. He mistook Arthur's silence for weakness and his flannel shirt for poverty, never realizing that the most dangerous men aren't the ones who brag about their power, but the ones who keep it holstered until it's absolutely necessary. In the end, Richard lost everything. Not because he made a business mistake, but because he lost his humanity. He prioritized a fleeting pleasure over his dying child, and the universe, in the form of a grieving grandfather, balanced the scales with terrifying precision. If you enjoyed this story of intense karma and justice, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to see that arrogance always comes before the fall. And make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. What would you have done if you were Arthur? Let me know in the comments below.